In this episode, I'm going to talk with Andy Behar of As You Sow. As You Sow is a nonprofit leader in shareholder advocacy. This is the Impact Financial Planners podcast with Bill Holliday, brought to you by AIO Financial, a fee-only financial planning firm specializing in socially responsible investing at AIOfinancial.com. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I'm excited to get back to podcasting, and I've got several interviews lined up. They should be coming out pretty regularly now. I'm excited to have my interview with Andy Behar, the As You Sow CEO. Has 30 years of experience as a senior executive and strategist in the clean tech, communications, and life science sectors. He served as COO for a social media agency focused on sustainability and has been a strategic consultant in the nonprofit sector. He's a member of the board, the U.S. SIF Social Investment Forum, and a member of the UN Sustainability Stock Exchange Green Finance Advisory Group. Let's go to our interview. As You Sow is a nonprofit leader in shareholder advocacy. Could you just describe some of the services, some of the things you provide?
Sure. Well, we were founded in 1992, so we're about 25 years old. We just had our 25th anniversary last year. And we were founded to work on corporate accountability. We basically get big companies to do big things, and we do that through the leverage of shareholder power. That empowered shareholders have a lot of power, and a lot of people don't use that power or really know about it. But as shareholders, we talk to companies about their own best interests on issues like environmental health, human rights, climate, and we generally talk to them in business terms because the markets really are what drive things. And when it's advantageous to the company and advantageous to the planet, then you see companies start to make changes that really become part of their DNA and really take hold and have long-term effects.
So who are you working with, or who shareholders in what form are you working with?
All different types. Well, because As You Sow is a nonprofit, we don't own any shares ourselves. So we're an advocacy organization. So take, for instance, the issue, I'm just going to pick one because we work on a lot of different areas. So one of our environmental health areas is antibiotics in meat, particularly looking at concentrated animal feedlots, CAFOs they're called. So in this case, we decided our strategy was going to be to work with companies like McDonald's, Wendy's, KFC, Burger King to get them to see that by switching their poultry supply chain to chicken that has no antibiotics, no human antibiotics, that it would be advantageous for their business. So we reached out to people, to shareholders in a network that we have, and said, who owns shares of Wendy's? And someone came forward and said, oh, I own shares of Wendy's. We explained what we're doing. They authorized us to file on their behalf. We filed the resolution. We talked to the company. It took a couple of years, but eventually we got all four companies to agree to change the way that their entire supply chain for poultry, which is a major piece of the poultry market, which then in turn affects the way these chickens are raised because they can't keep them as concentrated together if they can't give them the antibiotics. But ultimately what this does is it's really about that these superbugs were becoming antibiotic immune, and it was causing a real public health problem. And so the company saw that it was to their advantage to get on the right side of this. They did. We praised them in the media. And now we're working with all of them on pork and beef.
Oh, that's great. That's a great story. So through a network, does it help to have a lot of people involved, or how do you let the shareholders know that here's an issue you can vote on, or here's an issue you can support?
Well, there's two different questions there. An issue you can vote on, we do that through, we put out a publication every year, the first week in March, called Proxy Preview. And that lists not only our resolutions, but every resolution in the environmental, social, and some governance. So last year, there were about 430 resolutions that were all not only listed, but explained. And the proponents, the people who wrote the resolutions, actually got to write sidebars. We had about 35 different contributors to this publication. It's available for free at proxypreview.org,
Great.
and we are actually starting work on it, right after Labor Day. Um, so that's sort of a voting guide. That's how you can vote. We also publish guidelines, which are our recommendations of how we believe people should be voting on these resolutions, as well as on boards, as well as on CEO pay, gender equality, all these different issues. We have opinions about this, and we put a book of guidelines that you can download. You could hand it off to ISS, Glass Lewis, or whoever is doing your voting, and say, I want to vote this slate, and they could take that, and you would be voting the most progressive set of guidelines.
And
But
where
in
is that
terms of,
guideline? Where can you find that guideline list?
oh, that's also free on our website. Just if you type in guidelines in the search engine or go to our reports, it's there. It's downloadable.
Great.
But in terms of the network of people who are doing the filing and co-filing, so last year we filed, I think it was 45 resolutions, and we had about 180 different shareholders. So not only is there a lead for every one of those, but there's people co-filing. So in case of, some of these resolutions, we might have, there might have been 10 co-filers, so a lead filer and 10 co-filers. And when the companies see that a lot of people are co-filing, it definitely makes a difference. And it also helps you when you're doing your proxy memos. And ultimately, whenever we file a resolution, it's an escalation of an engagement. We don't want to ever file a resolution. We'd much rather give a company a phone call or write them a letter, and they say, wow, what a great idea, let's go do it. Much better for us, much less resources expended than the company saying, no way. And then we have to publicly, explain this to the press that the company doesn't want to change this. So, for instance, let's take another example this year, Starbucks and the plastic straws. So
Yeah.
for a couple of years, we've been talking to Starbucks about this. We've been filing resolutions. And this year, things just escalated to the point where their brand was being associated with the destruction of the oceans. The plastics in the ocean is just overwhelming. And people seeing images of all of these sea turtles dying, but also just the beaches just covered with tons and tons of garbage all over the world. And Starbucks' name on it because Starbucks cups were there. Starbucks finally decided this year to get ahead of it. And so they agreed to stop using 3 billion plastic straws. A similar thing happened this year with Dunkin' Donuts. They agreed to stop using 1 billion styrofoam cups. And we've been talking to them about that for a few years, but now their brand's getting associated with the destruction of the oceans. McDonald's also agreed to not only stop using 1 billion styrofoam cups, but stopping using styrofoam in all of their operations globally, which means styrofoam trays in Asia and all of that. They're simply not going to be buying any more styrofoam, which not only is good for the oceans, but it's also, if you think about what goes into those styrofoam, those are all coming from plastic feedstock, which is all oil and gas. So hydraulically fracked gas is then sent to these ethane crackers where they crack it into, all of its component parts, methane, ethane, etc. So it's a whole supply chain for the plastics. And that's the whole thing about single-use plastics. It's not just the ocean where we're disposing them after we use them once. It's the whole supply chain from the destruction of water resources where the hydraulically fracked gas is being extracted. And that's a lot of it's in the United States now, but also the cracker plants, which have huge footprints, huge negative environmental footprints, where they're disposing of waste both in the water and in the air. And so that's the whole thing. It's all connected. And if you can get after these companies to stop using so much of this material, it ripples through the supply chain.
And how was the process with Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts or McDonald's? Was it just discuss it with them, or did you need to have an awareness campaign to get pressure, or was it shareholder resolutions that finally did it?
Again, we when we find an issue, we'll send a letter. And we hope that the company will say, again, this is a great idea. Thank you for helping us avoid risk. Generally, our letters would say, we see a risky situation coming down the pike. We think that we're like the best first responders for corporations. Like we're saying, look, there's risk, there's risk. And if they respond and address it, they get so far ahead of it and have such a competitive advantage. But oftentimes they just decide we're going to ignore that till there's greater pressure. And so we generally do a media campaign, so it gets into the press, which generally could get some of their customers angry with them, and some letter writing campaigns start, and some of the grassroots groups start to protest. In the case of Starbucks, I mean, Greenpeace had like a street. The streets were filled with people protesting at the annual meeting against Starbucks. They're in Seattle, their hometown,
Oh,
and the city of Seattle had banned straws before anybody else. So they were getting messages strongly from across the globe. So it wasn't just us. We were there in the boardroom and in the annual meeting with a formal resolution that's an SEC document that's in, it's got to be in their 8K. And so we're taking like the more formal route. Now, we had told them a couple of years ago, hey, let's get this taken care of. You can get ahead of all this. They decided to wait until their brand was tarnished. They got associated with really bad actors, with being a bad actor. And then they finally said, okay, let's do it. And then everybody says, oh, okay, now you're okay, you're a hero. But they could have avoided all of that stuff.
sure.
Another example this year was Monster Beverage. We wrote them a letter saying, you know, you guys just scored a 0, dead last on a scorecard called Know the Chain. It's about slavery and forced labor in your supply chain. And we wrote them a letter and said, you know, as shareholders, we think this is kind of bad, associating our brand with slavery and forced labor. They wrote us back a letter and said, you know, well, we don't really care about that. And so we said, all right, well, then we'll file a resolution. We escalated to a resolution, and then we're sitting talking to a senior vice president who's, you know, an attorney, in-house attorney, and trying to make some headway. And they simply said, we just don't think this is anything we should spend a nickel of corporate money on. We don't think this is that serious. And we said, well, we think it is. We think that you guys scoring, I mean, dead last, not only in the food and beverage sector, but in every sector, they were the worst company because they simply refused to disclose anything. They simply just said, we're not going to follow the law in terms of just reporting to the UK Modern Slavery Act. We're not going to follow the law, which is they have to report to the California Supply Chain Transparency Act. They're literally, they just said, we're just going to ignore the law, which we think that's a risky thing to do for a $35 billion company. And so we wanted shareholders to know about this. So whenever we file a resolution and it's going to go to a vote, in other words, we're not going to withdraw it, because at any point Monster could say, you know what, we're going to take care of this. Here's what we're going to do. We would have withdrawn the resolution. It wouldn't go to a vote.
Sure.
So we do a lot of education. We talk to investors, and that's through investor proxy services like ISS and Glass Lewis. We brief them why this is an issue, why this is an issue that could be detrimental to the company, how this might lead to risk, to litigation, to negative brand associations. We also go and we talk to the big pension funds. We talk to UNPRI. We talk to, that's the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment. We talk to the Council on Institutional Investors. So all told, UNPRI, signatories is like $70 trillion of assets. We basically want to talk to those folks, and we want to say, look, here's what you should vote against. You should vote for our resolution. Even though management says it's not important, it really is. What's interesting with that vote, and we got a 20% vote, is now we're looking at who voted for it and against it. And we're seeing that groups like the Ohio PERS, the public pension fund of Ohio, voted against a resolution asking a company to disclose information on slavery. Why? Well, we're going to talk to Ohio PERS. We're also going to ask Norges, that's the Norwegian pension fund. Why did you vote against this? We also see that a lot of mutual funds voted against it. And we're going to talk to them, and we're going to do some public outreach saying, why are you investing in mutual funds for a company that thinks slavery is okay? So we're going to ask those questions, and we're going to see what happens next year.
And then possibly have another resolution or
Oh yeah.
continue engaging.
Well, we'll continue to engage them. We heard that they called up Know the Chain and they asked Know the Chain, what can we do to get a better score? And so the
Oh,
folks at Know the Chain are saying, well, you could first of all disclose to the UK Modern Slavery Act and the California, basically everything in our resolution. We gave them a laundry list of what they could do. So we'll see if they do anything, and if they do, great. We will withdraw and see if they can improve.
so out of 45 to 50 resolutions that you file,
Mhm.
how many engagements do you have a year?
Probably 60, 70,
Okay.
because these are the ones that escalated to a resolution. We have relationships with a lot of companies. So just on climate change, I mean, we talked to Exxon and Chevron. We talked to Anadarko. We talked to on our website. There's if you go to the asyousow.org website, there's a click you can click on. I'm just going to go do it just so. It right up at the top, it says resolutions, and if you click on resolutions, it's a resolution tracker, and so everything from 2018 is there. So we talked to AIG, which is insurance company, about climate change. We talked to Ameren about coal, Anadarko about climate change, Chevron. Chevron, we had an interesting resolution about actual transition. We think that a lot of the climate resolutions that have been brought forward, and over the last 7 years, there's been 160 climate resolutions at oil and gas companies, but they're all nibbling around the edges. They're not actually getting the company to change their scope 3 emissions, the actual emissions from their products. And so this resolution is escalating that in terms of really asking the company to lay down a plan of how they're going to be Paris compliant, how they're going to actually be compliant with a 2-degree world. Right now, all the plans that we're seeing are 4-degree plans. The Exxon report in 2017, there was a resolution asking for a 2-degree plan from Exxon. And there was a majority vote on that. It was led by New York State Common Retirement Fund and the Church of England. And they came out with a report that was a 5-degree report, and it was deemed to be, quote, and I'm using my quotes there, defective by major analysts. It was a real insult, I think, to shareholders who really did this quite seriously. And we tried to get a group of shareholders to vote against the Exxon board, because the board should be responsible for this. And it was interesting because with 62% voting for the resolution, and then they did do a report, but the report was defective. So it was as if they didn't do the report, really. And yet we couldn't get all of these shareholders to vote to knock somebody off the board. So that's an interesting thing, too, that the shareholders aren't strong enough to actually say, okay, somebody is responsible.
Yeah.
We believe firmly that the board needs to be actually responsible for the actions of the company, and that if they're not, there needs to be an action taken. So that's a place I think shareholders could do way better, is really understanding the dynamics of the board and who on the board is responsible. We did a whole campaign around that, but anyway, you can look at the resolution tracker. You can also go back years, or you can sort it by company, or however you want to do it.
Great. That's a great tool. How can,
Yeah.
if people are interested, how can they get involved? I see, I mean, the proxy voting or the proxy preview, you have some good tools or resources.
First thing they can do is know what they own. We find that a lot of people aren't even aware that they own a lot of these companies either as equities, where they can vote, or in a mutual fund.
Yeah.
And that brings me to a whole set of tools that we've built, because we discovered that most people don't really understand what they own, and that most people are invested through a 401k plan, which
Sure.
means that they are invested in mutual funds. And a mutual fund is a basket of stocks. So a mutual fund that you might be invested in might have 700 stocks, or 2,000 stocks, or 25 stocks, depending on the fund. Knowing what those stocks are is really critically important, because you do have power even as a shareholder of a mutual fund. So we created some tools. One of them, if you go on our website, again, right on the front page, and you click on Invest Your Values, you'll come to a page and you can either go to fossil-free funds, where if you type in any mutual fund, it'll tell you exactly which companies you own that have reserves, like Exxon and Chevron, which coal-fired utilities you own, like Southern and Duke, which oil field services companies like Halliburton you own, which pipeline companies you own. It's all laid out there, very simple, and also what your footprint is. So we aggregate up the scope 1 and 2 emissions of every company in a fund. So we have this big number of how much carbon, all the companies, we divide by the dollar amount. So now you have a tons of carbon per $1 million US. So you can compare any two funds.
Sure.
So you might go in there and you might say, oh, I have this Fidelity fund in my 401k. Click on it. You might see 200 tons of carbon per million US. Then you can go click on some of the clean ones, and we list all of those. If you just click the green button, you go to a list of about 45 totally clean ones, and they're generally around somewhere between 10 and 20 tons. So if your plan offered one of those, you could decrease your carbon footprint by 10x just with that's very simple. Oftentimes the plans only have a very limited number, and none of them are fossil free. None of them are ESG. That means none of them are environmental, social, and governance. In other words, the companies that they pick are not using environmental, social, and governance metrics.
Right.
That's a problem, and that's something that we're working on. We're actually working with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, 200 biggest companies in the world, because all these companies have made commitments to the UN sustainability goals. So they've said we've made a commitment to do better on climate, and a lot of them have. You look at companies that have taken their data centers completely into renewables, that have they're just turning off the lights at night. They're just reducing their carbon footprint. They're using fuel efficient vehicles, doing really good stuff. Yet in their 401k plans, they have nothing sustainable. It's a real kind of a gap in the way corporate mindset is, and we're trying to understand that and trying to help them, because we believe that there's employees at all these companies that would invest in an environmental, social, and governance fund, and also those funds tend to be outperforming, particularly in the last 5 years when the oil industry has been underperforming. Those mutual funds, I can tell you personally, we switched at As You Sow, we switched our 401k plan over. So it's about 20% fossil free. We also have ESG funds. We also have ones that are very women centric. And a lot of our mutual funds have been outperforming the market, considerably. So
yeah, that's great.
There's fossil free funds. There's weapon free funds. You can see whether you've got nukes, cluster munitions, landmines, assault weapons in your portfolio. There's tobacco free. There's one called deforestation that looks at palm oil. November 1st, we're going to be launching gender equality funds, and that's going to be looking at, we have data now on 4,000 companies looking at 12 different KPIs, key performance indicators on gender equality. So women on the board, equal pay, women in the C-suite, sexual harassment policy, all these different things. So we'll be aggregating that up, again, for mutual funds. And that's coming in November. Next year, we hope, if we get funded, because each one of these, we have to get a grant, to do a mass incarceration version, and also to do one on slavery and supply chains. So kind of following up on the monster.
That's great.
Story.
That's a great tool for people to easily visualize what they have.
Yeah, it's needed.
No, yeah, definitely. And how are you mostly funded by grants, or is it
we're about 90% funded by foundation grants and about 10% by individual donations. We're actually trying to shift that into more individual donations, because the grants tend to be restricted. So, we'll get a grant to work just on genetically modified organisms, like just on GMOs, or just on antibiotics, or just on ocean plastics. The funding we get from individuals is unrestricted, so we can use it as we need it. We can build tools and things that, like if we got more just funding from individuals, we may decide to put it into the prison free funds tool, whereas we can't do that with the restricted grants.
That makes sense. That's great. I really appreciate your time, Andy. How can people get more information or get in touch with you if they have questions?
As You Sow, ASYOUSOW, as in the biblical phrase, you reap what you shall sow, or you sow what you shall reap. You reap what you shall sow. asyousow.org, and you can click and you can just put in your email address, and you can get a newsletter. We send out a newsletter, I don't know, every couple of months, 3 times a year. We try not to send too much stuff. We do a lot of reports. So whenever we have a new report, we let people know you can download it. We just released a report last week called the Clean 200, looking at the most investable, the cleanest companies in the world. We look at the top 200 every 6 months just to look at the trends. It's really a thought experiment on what is the clean energy future. But we come out with reports pretty regularly, maybe 4 or 5 a year. You can also click, there's a donate button. Please feel free to donate. We really appreciate that. And then my email's on the website. So if you want to write me a note, if you want to say, you know what, I'd like to co-file or file, we can put you on the list. We have a seeking shares list. And people all the time just send me an email and say, I'd like to see what you guys are looking for. And then who knows, we might be filing with Abbott on what we did on genetically modified organisms. Just, a person said, oh yeah, I own Abbott, and they can become part of this whole empowered shareholder movement.
That's great. That's super. It's really important what you're doing. I appreciate you letting us know what's going on there.
Sure, my pleasure.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okay, you take care. I appreciate your time as well. Take care.
Right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, that wraps up our interview with Andy. Thank you very much for joining me. As I said, I have several other podcasts in the works or episodes in the works that'll be out shortly. Thank you for listening to Impact Financial Planners Podcast. This has been brought to you by AIO Financial. If you need help with any part of your finances, please contact AIO Financial for a free meeting. They work with clients throughout the U.S. AIOfinancial.com. As always, I appreciate any feedback you have, good, bad, otherwise, comments, suggestions. You can contact me on Facebook or email me, bill@AIOfinancial.com. Give a call, write comments, anything. It's all good. If you like these podcasts, please consider leaving a review and rating. It'll help other people be able to follow and find this easier. Or like the videos, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Any of that helps. All right. Thanks a lot. Take care.